Doubt. The lights are low. He picks up his glass, stares at it the way people stare at things when they're not really seeing them at all, and he says to no one in particular, "Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine." It is one of the most quoted lines in the history of cinema. And when you hear Humphrey Bogart deliver it, something happens. Something settles behind your ribs. Because he is not acting heartbreak, he is reporting it. That quiet devastation in his voice, the way the words come out slow and bitten and dry, as if even their pronunciation is costing him something. That is not technique, that is memory. That is a man who knew exactly what it felt like to be unmade by someone and have to keep walking around the earth as if he hadn't been. The world knew Humphrey Bogart as the toughest man in Hollywood, the man who could silence a room just by walking into it, the man who delivered those clipped, sardonic lines with a raised eyebrow and a cigarette between his fingers and made it look like nothing in the world could touch him. He was Rick Blaine, and Sam Spade, and Charlie Allnut. He was the private eye, and the war hero, and the noble outlaw. He was the icon rather than the myth. What you find is something considerably more complicated and considerably more human, a boy raised in privilege and emotional poverty, a young man who spent 20 years failing a story that was also an act of betrayal, a political stand he was too afraid to maintain, and at the end, a man who spent his final year being carried up the stairs of his own home by the woman who had loved him faithfully for 12 years, too ravaged by cancer Hollywood ever allowed you to see. This is the shattering life of Humphrey Bogart. December 25, 1899, Sloan's Hospital, New York City. A baby boy was born on Christmas mornings of children that were distributed in newspapers and magazines across the country. There is a particular irony in this. Maude Humphrey made her reputation drawing idealized, rosy-cheeked, cherub-faced children for mass consumption, selling images of warmth and childhood sweetness to millions of American households. And at home, she raised her own children with a rigid formality that left almost no room for the ordinary affections of parenthood. She did not hug easily. She did not offer comfort readily. She had standards, exacting and uncompromising standards, about behavior and appearance and achievement, and she applied them to her children with the same precision she applied to her commercial work. The Bogart home on West 103rd Street in Manhattan, later Riverside Drive, was prosperous and well-appointed, and fundamentally cold in the ways that mattered most. Belmont Bogart was no warmer. He was a man who had developed a serious addiction to morphine, a habit that had begun medically and evolved into dependency, and which depleted the family's finances in ways that became acute as the years went on. He was distant and unreliable and prone to long silences. When his children needed him, he was frequently not there in any useful sense, physically present perhaps, emotionally absent in the manner of men who have surrendered large portions of themselves to a chemical habit they cannot break. Between the two of them, Humphrey Bogart grew up understanding with bone-deep certainty that love was not freely given, that approval had to be earned and was never guaranteed, and that the world was not organized around his comfort or happiness. He had a younger sister, Frances, and another sister, Catherine, and they all moved through the same silent household, learning the same lessons. You performed well. You did not cause scenes, you met the standard, or you faced the withering judgment of a mother whose tongue, multiple accounts agree, could draw blood. Humphrey was not academically distinguished. He attended Trinity School in Manhattan, where his performance was unremarkable. He was sent to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in the country, because his parents intended him for Yale and a career in medicine. What happened at Andover is a matter of competing accounts. Some say he was formally expelled. Some say he left under circumstances that were mutually agreed upon to avoid formal action. The factors in the departure included smoking, drinking, poor academic performance, and possibly inappropriate interactions with staff. He was somewhere between 17 and 18 years old. He had failed at the path his parents had laid for him before the path was even properly begun. He was, in the blunt terminology of his era, a disappointment. What he did next would change the direction of American cinema. But first it would change him. In 1918, at 18 years old, Humphrey Bogart enlisted in the United States Navy. America had entered the First World War the previous year, and the Navy was one of the paths available to a young man who had nowhere obvious to go and no particular plan for getting there. He served as a seaman and was assigned to USS Leviathan, one of the largest troop transport ships in the American fleet. He was later transferred to USS Santa Olivia. His service record suggests a competent if unremarkable period of military duty. He was discharged in 1919, after the armistice had already ended the war, at the rank of coxswain. He came out of the Navy with something he had not gone in with, a scar on his upper lip, and a slight but distinctive lisp that accompanied it. The origin of that scar became one of Hollywood's most debated biographical mysteries, and the studio system, which had a long tradition of manufacturing mythology around its stars, eventually settled on an explanation. The story they distributed was that a prisoner in naval custody had struck Bogart during a transfer, a handcuffed man who swung the cuffs into Bogart's face, catching him across the lip and opening a wound that healed imperfectly. Whether this story is true is disputed by multiple biographers. Some have suggested the wound came from combat with an officer in a barroom fight. Some have suggested it was a completely ordinary shipboard accident. Some have speculated the scar was congenital. The Navy's own records are not conclusive. Louise Brooks, the actress who encountered Bogart in New York in 1924, noticed significant scar tissue on his upper lip and speculated that he had undergone partial surgical repair of something more serious. The truth, if it exists somewhere in the documentary record, has never been definitively established. What is established is the effect the scar and the lisp became inseparable from Humphrey Bogart's screen persona. They contributed to something that could not be faked or manufactured, a quality of damage, of a man who had been marked by the world and was still standing, who had been hurt and had not let it stop him. It gave his face a particular quality of credibility. When this man told you that he had seen things, you believed him. When he warned you that the world was not safe, the evidence was written across his face. In Hollywood, where so much is constructed artifice, Humphrey Bogart's authenticity was built partly on a wound whose story even he may not have been entirely certain of. There is something in that which is very Bogart, the performance so complete it replaced the memory. He was 20 years old, discharged from the Navy, in a New York that was entering the era of jazz and prohibition, and the kind of feverish social energy that comes after catastrophic war. He needed to find something to do. He found the theatre, through a connection with family friend William A. Brady, a theatrical producer. Humphrey Bogart found his way onto Broadway in the early 1920s. He started at the very bottom, doing stage management, running errands, learning the mechanics of production from the inside. He was not immediately recognized as someone with particular talent. He was recognized as a young man from a good family who worked hard and showed up on time. His first credited stage role came in 1922. Over the following years, he appeared in at least 18 Broadway productions. He was cast almost exclusively as what the theatre of that era called the juvenile lead, the handsome young man in the blazer and the tennis whites, the dashing boyfriend, the charming dilettante. He played these roles with a kind of elegant competence that kept him employed, but did not make anyone think they were watching something special. Critics of that period, when they mentioned him at all, tended to describe him as pleasant or presentable or adequately light. They meant it as faint praise. He recognized it as a description of a career that was not quite going anywhere. He also began building the personal life that would occupy the next 2 decades with a level of turbulence that makes the careers of considerably more dramatic men look mild. In 1926, at the age of 26, Humphrey Bogart married Helen Menken, a respected stage actress. The marriage lasted barely a year. The exact reasons were not discussed publicly in the way such things are discussed today, but both parties acknowledged that they had been fundamentally incompatible. Helen Menken filed for divorce in 1927. In 1928, Bogart married again. Mary Phillips was also an actress, quieter and more grounded than Helen Menken, and the marriage lasted considerably longer. They were together through most of the 1930s, though the relationship was strained by the long separations that resulted from Bogart's efforts to build a Hollywood career while Mary preferred to stay in New York and continue her stage work. He also drank, heavily and consistently, and with the particular dedication of a man who had discovered that alcohol was very efficient at quieting the voice inside him that kept saying he was not enough, would never be enough, was always going to be the tennis racket-carrying background figure in other people's stories. By 1930, Humphrey Bogart was 30 years old. He had 2 failed or failing marriages behind him. He had a solid but uninspiring stage career. He had been in a few Hollywood films, mostly small roles, mostly forgettable. He had his father's sardonic humor, his mother's cold precision, and a lip scar that nobody had figured out how to use yet. He was not yet Bogart. He was still just Humphrey. And Humphrey was not a star. The star was coming, but it would take a decade of near misses and outright failures before it arrived. In 1930, Humphrey Bogart signed his first significant Hollywood contract with Fox Film Corporation. The timing seemed promising. The film industry was in the middle of its transition to sound, and the studios were frantically searching for actors who could deliver dialogue convincingly. Bogart could. His voice was one of the most distinctive in any room he entered, low and dry and precise, with that slight sibilance from the lip scar that gave every word he spoke a quality of carefully withheld menace. Fox was not sure what to do with him. He made several films, mostly forgettable. The studio declined to renew his contract. He went back to Broadway, then back to Hollywood, then back to Broadway. The 1930s were a decade of commuting between two coasts and finding moderate success in neither. He landed at Columbia for a time, then at Universal. He made a string of pictures that few people saw and fewer people remembered. He was good in them, often better than the material deserved. Nobody was particularly paying attention. Warner Brothers finally signed him, and for several years he was cast almost exclusively as the snarling gangster who died in the third act. While James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson played the memorable criminals, Bogart played the forgettable ones, the gun thugs and the crooks who existed to be shot by the hero in the film's final sequence. He was, by his own account, killed on screen more times in the 1930s than any other working actor. He was 35 years old, then 36, then 37, and he was not a star. He was a working actor, which is a different thing entirely. A working actor has a career, a star has a presence. Bogart had the first without the second, and he knew it, and it gnawed at him through every Hollywood party and every dismissive studio memo and every role he was offered, because the more interesting option had already been refused by someone more valuable to the studio. He drank more. He said exactly what he thought to anyone who happened to be within earshot. He developed a reputation for difficulty that was partly earned and partly manufactured by a man who had learned that if the world was going to underestimate him, he might as well give them something interesting to misunderstand. He was also, privately, beginning to fall apart. His marriage to Mary Phillips was over in all but the formal sense. They divorced in 1937, and into the space that the marriage vacated came someone who would define the next chapter of his life with an intensity that left marks neither of them could fully account for. Her name was Mayo Method, and what happened between them was not a love story in any traditional sense. It was more like a collision, two unstable elements introduced to each other, and the explosion that followed. Mayo Method was a stage and film actress, a small woman with dark eyes and quick intelligence who had made a reasonable career for herself in secondary roles. She and Bogart met in 1936 and were engaged in the particular destructive way that two heavy drinkers who are deeply attracted to each other sometimes become engaged. Through a series of scenes that were equal parts passion and catastrophe, they married on August 21, 1938. Bogart was 38 years old. Mayo was 31. She was known to their social circle by her husband's nickname for her, Sluggy. The nickname was not gentle, it was accurate. Their marriage was, by every credible account, characterized by violence in both directions. They drank together prodigiously, and then fought with an intensity that their neighbors, their colleagues, and their friends witnessed often enough that it stopped being scandalous and simply became expected. Mayo was wildly jealous. She believed, with what may have been some basis in fact given Bogart's history with women, that her husband was perpetually unfaithful. She confronted him about these suspicions at dinner parties. She confronted him about them in public. She confronted him about them with her fists, and on at least one documented occasion, with a knife. Bogart arrived on set during this period with injuries that costumers and makeup artists were required to conceal. He showed up to meetings with bruises and scratches that he explained with varying degrees of inventiveness. The press, which had a much more obliging relationship with studio publicity departments in that era than it would develop later, cooperated in keeping the violence largely out of public view. What they did publish, which was the two of them drinking and fighting in restaurants and nightclubs, was framed as colourful bohemian eccentricity. Bogart and Sluggy and their wild marriage became almost a brand. People found them entertaining, but the entertainment was also genuine suffering. Mayo Method was not simply a violent drunk. She was a woman whose career was declining as her husband's was about to explode, and who could see the trajectory even if she could not stop it. She was losing her professional footing at the precise moment her husband was gaining his. The jealousy that produced violence was partly the jealousy of an actress watching stardom pass her by and land on the man sleeping next to her. It was the rage of someone who had been told implicitly and explicitly by the industry she worked in that she was not quite enough, and who took that verdict out on the person closest to her because the industry was too large and too indifferent to absorb it. None of this excuses what happened between them, but it explains some of it, and explanation, even when it falls short of excuse, is important. The studio had no choice. They needed Howard. They took Bogart. The Petrified Forest was released in 1936, and Bogart's Duke Monty was the performance people remembered. It was not the largest role in the film. It was the one that left marks. There was something about the way Bogart played Duke Monty, the stillness of the danger, the sense of a man who had made peace with his own violence in a way that was more frightening than any amount of scenery chewing, that made audiences understand for the first time that this man was different from the other Warner Brothers contract players in ways that mattered. Roles improved. The long decade of playing the dying gangster began its slow conclusion, and then came 1941, and two films that together rebuilt Humphrey Bogart from the foundation up, High Sierra, in which Bogart played Roy Earle, a career criminal who wants nothing more than one successful score and a quiet life, transformed him from supporting player to leading man. He brought to Earle a weariness and an unexpected tenderness that the gangster archetype had never quite carried before. Roy Earle wanted to be something other than what he was, and you believed it, because the man playing him clearly understood that desire from the inside. Later that same year, John Huston's The Maltese Falcon arrived, and with it Bogart became a legend. Sam Spade was he would do things that were ruthless, even cruel, because the code he lived by demanded them. He would not do things that violated that code, regardless of the personal cost. And Bogart played this contradictory, complicated man with this for 2 decades. He was not a young discovery. He was a man who had paid for his moment in the currency of years. And then came 1942, and controlled Morocco was a man who had loved completely and been left, and who had responded to that devastation by becoming someone who claimed to believe in nothing. Think carefully about what Bogart brought to that character, and then think about his life by 1942. 3 broken marriages, 20 years of professional near misses, a drinking habit of industrial scale, a childhood that had provided every material advantage and almost no emotional sustenance, an unstable, violent home life with Mayo method. Rick Blaine was not entirely fiction. Rick Blaine was Humphrey Bogart in a white dinner jacket, performing a slightly elevated version of a man he knew from the inside. "I'm the only cause I'm interested in," Rick tells Ilsa when she finds him again in Casablanca, and you believe it completely, because the man saying it has earned that line through everything you can see has happened to his face. In 1943, director Howard Hawks was casting To Have and Have Not, a loose adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's novel that Hawks was retooling into something less faithful to the source and considerably more commercial. He needed a leading man and a leading woman. He had Bogart. He was searching for the woman. A 19-year-old model and actress named Betty Joan Persk had recently been signed by Warner Brothers after her face appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. She had been given the stage name Lauren Bacall, and she had not yet appeared in a single film. Howard Hawks's wife had seen the magazine cover and recommended the girl to her husband. Hawks called the girl in, looked at her, and decided she was exactly what he needed. Lauren Bacall arrived on the set of To Have and Have Not in early 1944. She was 19 years old. Humphrey Bogart was 44. The age difference between them was 25 years. She was frightened on set in the particular way of someone who knows they are in the presence of people who have earned their places and is not yet certain they have earned theirs. To manage the fear, she used a trick she had developed. She pressed her chin to her chest and looked up through her brows at whoever she was playing a scene with. It was a posture of concealed vulnerability, and on screen it became one of the most iconic looks in cinema history. It became known simply as the look. Every film student since has studied it. It happened the first time because a nervous girl didn't want anyone to see how scared she was. Bogart noticed her immediately. He was by all accounts not a man who fell easily or completely. He had spent his life constructing emotional defenses that were by 1944 about 20 years thick. He had been married 3 times. He had been hurt in the particular ways that people are hurt by marriages that fail violently and publicly. He was not looking for what he found. What he found was a woman who was genuinely his intellectual equal. who gave back exactly what she was given in terms of wit and directness and refusal to be intimidated, and who looked at him with those eyes under that dark brow, with an expression that seemed to suggest she could see past the performance to the man behind it, and was interested in that man specifically. There is a scene in To Have and Have Not that is so famous it has been referenced and quoted and parodied for 80 years. Bacall's character, Slim, stands in Bogart's hotel room doorway, about to leave. She turns back and says, "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow." Then she walks out. She was 19 years old when she filmed that scene, and every frame of it belongs to her completely. The chemistry on screen was not manufactured, it was documented. By the time To Have and Have Not wrapped production, Humphrey Bogart was deeply, irretrievably in love with Lauren Bacall. He was still married to Mayo Metho. He told Bacall, as clearly and honestly as a man in his position could manage, what the situation was. He told her he was afraid. He told her that his marriages had been disasters, that he had a pattern that did not speak well of his ability to sustain genuine love, that she was 19 and he was 44, and the world would have opinions about that which she would have to live inside of. He told her everything that was wrong with the two of them being together. She was 19. She had just become Lauren Bacall, and she told him she understood all of it and wanted to be with him anyway. He filed for divorce from Mayo Methot in May 1945. The divorce was ugly, as divorces after violent marriages tend to be. Mayo did not let go easily. She contested. She argued. She appeared in public in states of visible distress that the press photographed dutifully. She threatened. She grieved. She drank. On May 21, 1945, Humphrey Bogart married Lauren Bacall at Malabar Farm in Ohio, the estate of novelist Louis Bromfield. Bogart was 45 years old. Bacall was 20 years old. She was 3 years younger than his career. The marriage that the world was skeptical of turned out to be the one that worked. They settled into a house on Mapleton Drive in the Holmby Hills section of Los Angeles, a neighborhood of old money and serious privacy that suited Bogart's fundamental desire to be left alone by people he had not personally invited into his company. The house was comfortable and lived in, stocked with books and records, and the particular carefully arranged chaos of two intelligent people who had decided to occupy the same space permanently. Bogart was not, in private life, the remote and sardonic figure he projected on screen. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, a man of considerable warmth who had learned to conceal that warmth behind layers of wit and deliberate abrasiveness, because the world, as he had experienced it, tended to exploit the parts of you that it could see. He was funny, genuinely and often unexpectedly funny, with a sense of humor that could be dry as sand or surprisingly silly depending on his mood and his company. He read voraciously. He was a serious chess player. He sailed his yacht, the Santana, up and down the California coast with the focus and technical competence of someone who took the activity seriously rather than treating it as a status symbol. In 1949, Lauren Bacall gave birth to their first child, Stephen Humphrey Bogart. In 1952, their daughter Leslie Howard Bogart arrived, named for the man who had given Bogart his first real chance in film 15 years earlier. Bogart was, by multiple accounts, a father who engaged with his children with genuine interest and presence. He was 50 when Leslie was born, old to be a new father even by the standards of his era, but he adjusted the cadence of his life to accommodate them in ways that his own parents had never quite managed. Around the dining table, and in the living room of the Mapleton Drive house, Bogart and Bacall assembled the social circle that became known as the Holmby Hills Rat Pack. The name was reportedly coined by Bacall after a trip to Las Vegas with the group when she surveyed the disheveled collection of friends who had accompanied them and said they looked like a pack of rats. The original group included Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, David Niven, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and others. They gathered for dinners and poker nights and conversations that were not about business, where the rule was that you left the professional performance at the door and spoke honestly and often rudely, in the manner of people who have no need to impress each other. Bogart was the center of gravity in that group. He was the oldest and had been in the business the longest, and he had a kind of earned authority that people recognized without needing to have it explained. He was also, characteristically, the one most likely to say the uncomfortable thing, to cut through the social performance with a precise and unamused observation that made everyone else in the room simultaneously grateful and slightly nervous. He was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely happy. Not the performed contentment of a man who had decided to appear satisfied. actual happiness, the kind that comes from having built, finally, a life that contains the people and the work and the habits you actually want. It lasted 12 years. It was enough. Barely. In the fall of 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee descended on Hollywood with the particular appetite of a body that has been given a mandate and no meaningful restraint. The committee was investigating what it claimed were communist influences in the American film industry. What it was actually doing was conducting a campaign of intimidation and ideological enforcement that would eventually destroy hundreds of careers and lives and compromise the integrity of an entire industry. 10 screenwriters and directors who became known as the Hollywood 10 were called before the committee, refused on First Amendment grounds to answer questions about their political associations, and were cited for contempt of Congress. The movie studios, terrified of the political and economic consequences of being associated with alleged communist sympathizers, moved within days to blacklist all 10 men from employment in the industry. Humphrey Bogart, along with Lauren Bacall, John Huston, and a group of other prominent Hollywood figures, organized the Committee for the First Amendment in response. They were not communists. They were not defending communism. They were defending the constitutional principle that American citizens could not be compelled by a congressional committee to answer questions about their political beliefs or associations. On October 27, 1947, Bogart and Bacall and their group flew to Washington, D.C. On a chartered plane they called the Star for Freedom. They held press conferences, they attended the hearings and sat in the gallery. They made public statements about the danger of congressional committees overriding constitutional rights. Bogart was the most prominent person in the group, and his presence gave the protest a visibility that it would not otherwise have commanded. He was 47 years old, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, willing to put his career at risk to take a public stand on a principle he believed in. It was one of the genuinely admirable moments of his life. Then the studio machinery went to work on him. Warner Brothers told him, through intermediaries and direct conversations, what this was going to cost him if he continued. The press, which had initially treated the Washington protest as a legitimate political action, began to shift its tone under pressure from studio publicity departments and conservative columnists who were happy to use the Red Scare for their own purposes. Bogart's courage was reframed as naivety. His constitutional argument was reframed as evidence of dangerous sympathies. He was told that he would be destroyed, professionally and publicly, if he did not step back. He stepped back. On December 3, 1947, Bogart published a statement in Photoplay magazine. He said that he had been a foolish and impetuous American who had not fully understood the implications of what he was doing. He said he was not a communist and had never been a communist. He essentially retracted the position he had taken in Washington 6 weeks earlier. He said, in the language of a man who had decided that survival required the performance of a kind of public humiliation, "I was wrong." He was not wrong. The Hollywood 10 were not communists. The First Amendment was the First Amendment. What Bogart had argued in Washington was correct and constitutional and right. He retracted it because the alternative was the destruction of the life he had built. He knew what he had done. He spent the rest of his life knowing. Those who were close to him in the years after 1947 have described a particular tightness that entered his face whenever the Hoke period came up in conversation, a quality of compressed something, shame or anger or both, in combination, that he was not willing to discuss and could not entirely conceal. He had been afraid. He had chosen the career over the principle. It was a human choice. It was also a choice that cost something permanent. In 1951, John Huston called Humphrey Bogart with a project. Huston was directing an adaptation of C.S. Forester's novel The African Queen, and he wanted Bogart to play Charlie Allnut, a hard-drinking, scruffy, profoundly unglamorous riverboat operator who is pressed into unlikely heroism during the First World War. The female lead would be Katharine Hepburn. They would shoot on location in the Belgian Congo and Uganda. It was not a comfortable proposition. The Congo in 1951 was remote, disease-ridden, impossibly humid, and infested with insects and parasites that did not distinguish between film stars and everyone else. The production was arduous in ways that the controlled environment of a Hollywood studio lot simply could not have prepared anyone for. Most of the cast and crew fell ill during production. Katharine Hepburn contracted dysentery from contaminated water and lost a significant amount of weight during filming. Humphrey Bogart, famously, did not get sick. He attributed this to the fact that he was drinking Scotch whiskey rather than water, which was, as he pointed out with considerable satisfaction, demonstrably sterile. Whether the whiskey actually provided any protection against the waterborne pathogens that felled everyone around him, or whether his constitution was simply extraordinary, his survival became one of the legends of the production. He loved the work. Charlie Allnut was unlike anything Bogart had played before, genuinely comic, physically disheveled, vulnerable in ways that Rick Blaine and Sam Spade had never been allowed to be. He played him with an affection and a warmth that the character required, and that Bogart, by this point in his life, was more willing to allow the public to witness. When The African Queen was released in late 1951, it was immediately recognized as something special. At the 24th Academy Awards ceremony in March 1952, Humphrey Bogart won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 52 years old. It was the only Oscar he ever received, and it arrived as so many of his best things had arrived, decades later than justice required. He accepted the award with the dry, deflecting humor that was his permanent public mode, noting that it was nice to win something he'd been trying to get for a long time. He thanked the people who had helped him. He went back to his table and poured himself a drink, and was, by multiple accounts of those present, genuinely moved in a way he would not allow anyone to see too clearly. He was the king of Hollywood. He had earned the title with 20 years of work that nobody had noticed, and another 10 years of work that nobody could ignore. He had roughly 5 years left. By the early 1950s, the cigarettes had been doing their quiet, catastrophic work for decades. Bogart smoked with the consistency and volume of a man for whom the habit was not an indulgence but an operating system. 2 packs a day was the conservative estimate. In the final years of his life, the number was reportedly higher, the particular acceleration of someone who has been told they should stop but cannot make themselves believe it applies to them. The drinking had been doing its own damage in parallel, the liver and the esophagus absorbing years of alcohol in quantities that no human body is built to process without consequences. In late 1955, Bogart developed a persistent cough. He had difficulty swallowing. He lost weight in the way that people lose weight when something is taking it from them rather than when they are trying to give it. He ignored these signs with the determination of a man who has spent his life refusing to admit weakness. He was finally examined thoroughly, and the diagnosis came back with the bluntness that such diagnoses always carry: cancer of the esophagus. The middle of the esophagus, a location that made the surgical options complex and the prognosis correspondingly uncertain. On March 1, 1956, surgeons at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles performed a modified esophagectomy. They removed his entire esophagus. They removed 2 lymph nodes. They removed a rib to gain surgical access. Humphrey Bogart was 56 years old when they took him apart on that operating table, and what they put back together afterward was a man who was now in a fundamental struggle with his own body. He recovered from the surgery well enough to come home. He tried to be optimistic, in the manner that people try to be optimistic, when optimism is the last defensive position available. He came downstairs for visits from friends. He lost more weight. He held court from his home with characteristic stubbornness, maintaining the social routines that had defined his life for 20 years, because the alternative was to admit that something had fundamentally changed. By late 1956, he could no longer make the stairs easily. Lauren Bacall moved a dumbwaiter-style lift into the house so that her husband could travel between floors without having to climb. She adapted everything that could be adapted. She managed the household, managed the children, managed the steady stream of friends and colleagues who came to visit, managed the press, and managed her own fear, which was presumably considerable, with the same composure that she had brought to everything since she was a 19-year-old, trying not to show Humphrey Bogart that she was frightened. He was 57 years old, and he was dying, and he knew it. And she was 32 years old, and she knew it too. In the final months of 1956, Humphrey Bogart received his friends at his home with a deliberateness that suggested a man who understood he was saying goodbye, even when the goodbyes were framed as social calls. Frank Sinatra came often. They had been close since Sinatra joined the circle that revolved around Bogart and Bacall's home in the late 1940s. Sinatra, who was not by nature a tender man, was tender with Bogart in these visits in ways that those who witnessed them found striking. He would arrive and they would sit and drink and talk about films and politics and sailing, and both of them understood what these conversations were, which was a kind of vigil, but neither named it. Katharine Hepburn came, Spencer Tracy came, John Huston came, the people who had built careers alongside Bogart's, who had watched him work and fought with him and admired him and been frustrated by him and loved him, they came and sat in the house on Mapleton Drive and gave him the gift of their presence while they still had the chance to give it. Lauren Bacall did not leave. She organized everything around keeping him comfortable and keeping some version of normal life running in the house, because normality was something he valued and she understood that. She maintained the fiction, gently and collaboratively, that this was temporary, that he was getting better, because some fictions are not lies but acts of love. He was carried on the dumbwaiter when his body required it. He sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the garden and the yard. He smoked, because stopping at this point was a decision that the cancer had already made for him in every meaningful sense. He talked to his children when they came to see him, carefully, in the way of a man who is trying to deposit something permanent into young memories. On the evening of January 13th, 1957, Humphrey Bogart fell into a coma. On the morning of January 14th, 1957, at 2:30 in the morning, Humphrey Bogart died at his home in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. He was 57 years old. Lauren Bacall was with him. He was 57 years old. He had smoked cigarettes on screen for 30 years as a professional tool, a way of holding a scene, of punctuating dialogue, of signaling that a character was comfortable in his own skin, regardless of the danger around him. The cigarette had been his prop, and his instrument, and finally his undoing. A simple funeral was held on January 17th at All Saints Episcopal Church in Beverly Hills. John Huston delivered the eulogy. He spoke of the man rather than the icon, which was the only tribute Bogart would have wanted. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His ashes were placed in the casket with a small gold whistle, a reference to the line from To Have and Have Not that had introduced him to the woman who spent the last 12 years of his life beside him. You know how to whistle. The whistle went with him. When people talk about Humphrey Bogart's legacy, they tend to talk about the films, Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, The African Queen, The Big Sleep, Key Largo. They talk about the screen persona, the clipped delivery, the raised eyebrow, the cigarette, the quality of contained danger that made every character he played feel like someone with a past they were choosing not to discuss. All of that is real, and all of it deserves to be remembered. But Humphrey Bogart was also a boy who grew up in a house that provided everything except warmth, and who spent his entire adult life searching for the warmth his parents withheld. He found it, finally, and genuinely, in a 20-year-old woman who walked into his life when he was 44 and had every reason to be a lost cause, and who looked at him with those eyes and saw the man behind the performance and chose him anyway. He was a man who spent 20 years in professional obscurity, grinding through B pictures and dying gangster roles and television appearances that went nowhere, accumulating craft that nobody was watching, building the foundation for something magnificent in the total absence of anyone telling him it was worth doing. He never gave up. He never became self-pitying, or at least he never allowed the self-pity to win. He kept working, and when the moment came, he was ready for it, in a way that the overnight successes, the men who had arrived young and easily, frequently were not. He was a man who took a political stand when it cost something to do so, and who then retreated from that stand under pressure. The retreat was not his finest hour. He knew it. He carried it. If you want to understand what Humphrey Bogart was actually made of, consider both the stand and the retreat together, not separately, the courage to take the position in the first place, the very human fear that made him abandon it, the permanent awareness of what he had done. Most people in his position would have made the same choice. Most people in his position would also have known it was wrong. That self-knowledge, uncomfortable and unresolved, was part of what he put on screen in every role he played after 1947. He was a man who found genuine love at an age when most people have stopped believing it is still possible, and who had 12 years of it, which was not enough, and was more than he might have had if fate had arranged things differently. He was 57 years old when he died, which is not old. He had been working since 1922, which is 35 years of the kind of work that leaves marks on a person, and the marks were visible in the face that appears in his final photographs, in the thinness and the tiredness and the particular quality of someone who has been through a great deal and knows it. Think about Sam Spade refusing to cover up Bridget O'Shaughnessy's crime, even though he loved her, because his code required him to turn her in. Think about Rick Blaine in Casablanca, choosing to let Ilsa go because the cause was larger than what the two of them wanted. Think about Charlie Allnut, the drunk and the coward who found out he was neither when the circumstances required him to be something more. These were not characters Bogart played at a comfortable distance. These were versions of a conversation he was having with himself about what a man owes his own principles, about the price of courage, about what it means to do the right thing in a world organized primarily around the wrong one. He knew those characters from the inside because he had lived near the edge of the same questions, and the distance between the man he was and the man those characters were was smaller than any biography can fully measure. Humphrey Bogart, born December 25th, 1899 Deed, January 14th, 1957, aged 57. He told us, in frame after frame across 30 years of cinema, that the world was hard and that you met it straight, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going anyway. He meant it, because he had tested it. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are more stories like this one here, stories of lives that deserve to be understood in full, rather than reduced to the images history chose to keep. Thank you for watching.